Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Dr. Feruza Godrej, the Godrej family, Verinda Prathare, and the Godrej Archives for having me here, inviting me to give the 17th annual lecture. I'd also like to thank Shweta Sawant, Amruta Marathe, the Godrej staff, and also the staff of the Royal Bombay Yacht Club for their assistance in organizing the logistics for this lecture and coming to Mumbai. It is a real great honor to be here, and I'm particularly honored because historians really rely on archives and the stewardship of archivists to do the work that we do. While working on my recent project, it occurred to me that historians do not always tell archivists how important they are for safeguarding the records that we need for posterity, for having a commitment to the ethics of their profession, and for sharing their knowledge of their collections while we're in their spaces. All of this affects the ways in which our research unfolds. So given the archival setting, I thought that it would be appropriate for me to tell a story about that process today, the collaborative process of historical research and archival discovery, by talking about the American banking families who are the subject of my book, Gentlemen Bankers, The World of J.P. Morgan, and which laid the groundwork for my current project on the changing makeup of Wall Street after the Second World War. The title of my talk is a take on a saying that was made popular by a Hollywood film. And in the film, the main character says, "This is business, it's not personal." And it's tongue-in-cheek because its meaning in the film is exactly the opposite of what Michael Corleone claimed to say. If the statements of these fictional characters in The Godfather have resonated in the world of business, it's because the lived experience of business people consistently defy attempts to view economics as a field populated by rational actors. The story of Gentlemen Bankers, which is the story of private investment banking, is one that highlights this personal nature of business, though in and of itself, this is not a new topic nor a controversial one. The contribution of the book to the literature, I would say, is that it also asks us to think about what it means when social relations are absent or when personal animosity is present in a business where relationships are the foundation for the formation of trust. The book is especially interested in the barriers that stem, barriers to trust that stem from ethno-religious prejudice. And it argues that in the face of these barriers, private bankers were able to create trust, not because the desire for profit and money made them put these prejudices aside, which is the standard explanation, but that it was possible because of the way in which the world of finance was embedded in the gendered and racialized institutions of American society. As I will demonstrate, this is an embeddedness that was so fundamental, it could hide in plain sight, and it took careful archival and historical excavation to make visible. Gentlemen Bankers did not begin actually as a study of the personal nature of business. It began as a study of American empire in Asia. Before the Second World War, the American government's commitment to the liberal ideas of limited state power constrained its quest to promote free enterprise and expand American interests abroad. So its solution was to leverage the interests of America's private capitalists in order to compete with the imperial interests of the European nation states. This alliance between American private capital and American government was called dollar diplomacy. In 1909, J.P. Morgan and Company became the leading bank of the American group of the International Banking Consortium to China, or the IBC, whose ostensible purpose was to lend private money to China for the development of its national infrastructure, especially its railways. This was a purpose that it ultimately did not succeed in achieving, if it was ever its real purpose to begin with. There was one other American private bank in the original IBC agreement, and that was Kuhn Loeb and Company. In the late 19th century and until the First World War, Kuhn Loeb and Company was the Morgans' strongest competitor. Today, Kuhn Loeb's name has largely been forgotten by the general public, but at the time, it far outranked other private banks with 19th century pedigree, such as Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers, with whom Kuhn Loeb eventually merged. Founded in 1867, Kuhn Loeb grew rapidly under the leadership of Jacob Schiff, who's shown here, a German Jewish immigrant who joined the firm the year he married the daughter of one of the founding partners. Kuhn Loeb's position in the IBC reflected its elite status as Japan's foreign bankers, a status that they earned by underwriting the Japanese war effort in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Schiff had an intense animosity against the Russian Tsar because of the Tsar's pogroms against Jews. So when the Japanese government sent Finance Commissioner Kurihiro Takahashi to London to raise money for the war effort, the two joined forces. After Japan won the war against Russia in 1905, Schiff received a personal commendation from the Japanese emperor, and Takahashi's daughter, Wakiko, actually went to New York for 2 years to live with Schiff and his wife on the Upper East Side. Though the Morgans and the Schiffs worked together in the field of international finance, and both were committed to the expansion of Japanese empire in China, and though they had many common interests and values as private bankers, they were not friends. Their relationship contrasted with the Morgans' ties with bankers with whom they did a lot of business. When the Morgans corresponded with people with whom they were also close friends, there's a qualitative difference in the language that they use, which is evident in the letters that they wrote, such as those that are housed in the Pierpont Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. And in these letters, they talk about trust, they talk about love. They use the word love often. This is one of my interesting findings. So consider this cable from Myron Taylor, an industrialist, to the Morgan partners about the death of George Baker, who was the head of the First National Bank of New York, who was one of the predecessors of the modern-day Citibank, which was a key Morgan Bank collaborator. And so this cable reads from Myron Taylor, "Let us join together in our great sorrow, stop. I loved George greatly, as did you, stop. I shall return for final obsequies, much love, Myron." This is a very typical cable that you might read in the archive. Here's another one from Junius Morgan, who is Pierpont Morgan's grandson, and Jack Morgan, his father, who is Pierpont Morgan's heir and son. Note the use of the pet names for partners, like Bunny. Bunny refers to partner Bernard Carter. From your reply to our cable of last Wednesday, we feel sure you will agree with the firm policy we have adopted not to comment publicly in any way on the results of the election. You could see that it's 1936 FDR election for the present. All partners here, including Dean and Bunny, join me in bon voyage and love. The archives are full of these kinds of sentiments that intertwine business with personal, emotional care. And this was one of the things that I noticed as I was reading through their papers for several years. The same kind of care and concern are also reflected in the correspondence of Kuhn Loeb and Company between the partners and their friends, which are housed in the American Jewish Archives at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. But significantly, the correspondence between the Morgans and Kuhn Loeb, when you find it, does not evidence a close personal or sentimental relationship. This is not just because they were great competitors, but because of anti-Semitism. Jewish and Yankee bankers did not have overlapping social networks because starting in the late 19th century, Anglo-American Protestant social elites and institutions discriminated against persons of Jewish background. In general, the Morgans ignored Jews socially, as they did racialized minorities. Because they're ignoring them, it's not always obvious what they felt because they're just not there. But the picture of their anti-Semitic feelings did actually emerge in their personal papers as well. And case in point was that they were mainly expressed when they were forced to be in the same spaces as Jews when they couldn't be avoided. And one key example is on transatlantic crossings, on ships. So many of these mentions of Jews really only happened, for example, on ship stationery. So there's a way in which the material culture of the archive shared something about the sentiment that was being expressed. This is an example from 1924 from Jack Morgan to his mother. This is just a line to let you know that we are all right and having a really delightful voyage with no Jews and no one on board traveling with anyone else's wife. And there was an underline. There's another letter I could have shown you. It said, there's no Jews and no actresses. Like they're very unhappy about actresses. Now, the issue of anti-Semitism created obvious problems for a personal business like private banking, where one's self-respect and identity were essential to one's reputation. If the Morgan partners had ever directly expressed anti-Semitic views to the Kuhn Loeb partners, it would have made it impossible for them to do business. Schiff, for example, would not do business with the Reading Railroad because of the public anti-Semitism of its president. He wrote London banker Ernest Cassel, quote, "Our self-respect forbids us to have anything to do with this man, able as he may be." Now, given the nature of upper-class culture, the Morgan partners were not likely to be publicly anti-Semitic because the open expression of such views was considered untoward. But the absence of prejudice is not enough to create a foundation for trust. So the central question of the book, which I was telling Dr. Godrej, the book did not start off this way at all. Emerged from a recognition of these seemingly irreconcilable differences. And it was like a question that kept coming up. And those tend to be the ones that tell you this is what the book is about. And the question was this: in a business like private investment banking, where personal relations are so important, how did Anglo-American and German Jewish American bankers before the Second World War create trust and work together given the context of anti-Semitism? Now, historians have argued that even though the Morgans and the Schiffs were not friends, they respected each other and they worked together. Others have implied that anti-Semitism did not matter because it was only business or it was about the money. But there are a couple of issues with this idea. One is that the Morgans and Kuhn Loeb themselves stated in their words, both publicly and privately, that money was not their motivating factor. In fact, my first chapter starts on this, where Morgan is giving testimony at the Peugeot Money Trust hearings in Congress in 1912, and they ask him what is the most important thing in business, and they say, Untermeyer, who's the prosecutor, says, is it money? And Morgan says, no, it's honor, right? It's character. And they don't believe him. I think we should take our historical subjects seriously. That's the first thing, right? The second thing is that, and this is an empirical issue, and this is where the archives come into it, is that no one had actually tested how much work they actually did do together. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about my style as a historian is that I don't like to assume. I prefer to know what the sources say. And so one question the gentlemen bankers thus had to ask and answer was, how much work did Kuhn Loeb actually do with the Morgans? If, for example, we had discovered that they had not worked together, as had been previously assumed, then there would be no reason to go further because we would just conclude that they were socially and economically separate, and then that would be it. But we had to be able to test this theory. How could I test this theory? So the Morgans had 12 syndicate books, which were very large letters that listed every deal the Morgans took part in between 1894 and 1934. And there's also a series of books from the Drexel Morgan and Company papers, which was an earlier company that J.P. Morgan was a principal of. The purpose of a syndicate, which was first utilized in the United States in the early 19th century, was to spread the risk of underwriting very large capital projects. Unlike corporations where one risks only one's own investment, all the partners in a private partnership have personal unlimited liability. So they use syndicates as a way to manage that risk. Now, when one was asked to participate in a Morgan syndicate, it indicated that one had to be trusted enough, close enough, or important enough to be included, because syndicates were highly vetted. It was a privilege to be included. And the Morgans could dole out these privileges because in private banking, once a bank had an established relationship with a client, it was understood that that relationship would be respected and no action by any other bank would take place with that client without the original bank's explicit permission. This understanding was the central principle of gentleman banking. Gentleman banking is fundamentally a reference to an agreement to limit competition. Now, I was first made aware of the syndicate books by Maria Molestina, who's one of the archivists at the Pierpont Morgan Library, which is housed, as you saw in the photograph, in Pierpont and Jack Morgan's original homes on Madison Avenue between 36th and 37th Street in New York City. She mentioned it very casually to me as something I might be interested in looking at, and I remember saying, let's call it up and take a look. Lots of times, research is just about being very open to the process of discovery. And this is an example where it clearly paid off because the books turned out to be a major turning point. Because when I saw them, I realized that the books were like a friendship network, a picture of the Morgan's economic network of collaborators. In the books, each Morgan deal details the client, the deal, most do the profits and losses, and all the syndicate partners in the order in which they were given participations in the deal, usually with the largest at top. So the way that now these books are very large, and I'm not tall, so I had to stand to see them. When you open them up, they're about this fat, and they're about this big. The left side always lists the name of the deal and then details of the deal. Then in the middle, they would have stuffed the syndicate agreement, usually typewritten. This is the syndicate agreement for the U.S. Steel Corporation, which was the first billion-dollar corporation. And then on the right-hand side, it's all written in pencil, so you can imagine it's a lot of fun to read. And lists all the syndicate participants with the people who got the most participation at the top, and then it goes down. And there were over 1,000 in this deal, because it was huge. This is another example of the JIK Threshing Machine Company deal. You could see that JP Morgan was the only syndicate manager. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is because it's just a little easier to see. It will list the original purchasers, right? So you could see they got it at 92. And then they resell it to the syndicate for just a little bit more, making money off the spread, right? And then they sell it again to a private list. And you can tell, knowing the members of a deal could indicate how profitable a deal was expected to be. For example, in this deal, you could see that Mrs. Jane N. Morgan is given a participation. That's Jack Morgan's wife. Probably a very good deal, right? And in fact, all of the partners also had, starting from Charles Steele, their own participations as well. The profits could also be listed, and then the profits at every stage of the deal, right? In purchasing, in syndicate, in distribution. Now, knowing the amount of business a participant did could also tell you how important a participant was to the Morgans over a long period of time. Thus, I realized that the books could be used to answer the question about whether or not the Morgans did do business with Jewish bankers like Kuhn-Loeb relative to any bank. So basically, anytime you showed up in a deal here, what I did is I created an Excel file that was put in alphabetical order with your name. And then every time you were given participation in a deal, I wrote down the deal's name, the amount you were given, and then the year. And then all of this was aggregated into this giant, what I call master Excel file. Because the problem was the syndicate books as themselves do not tell us what we need to know. Right? This is part of the historical interpretation. So over a period of about 2.5 years, I translated every deal in those books into an Excel file and coded them according to the type, the client, and so on. And from this analysis, I was able to get a sense of the Morgans network, whom they work with, whom their clients were, whom they stopped working with, how their relationships changed over time. And so this, and I also broke it up into every 5-year period. So I was able to see, maybe you only did business with the Morgans before the First World War, and then it just stopped. Why? right? This was one of the things that I found for Speyer and Company. At a certain point, they just drop off. And then I had to go back to the qualitative sources actually in Guildhall to find out that they had a disagreement about a deal on Argentina that they felt that the Speyers had poached them on, and that's why they just were stopped giving participations. These kind of things. All of this analysis, the only thing you see in the book is like this chart and one other. But the research on the back end is the basis for my confidence in saying that I know who the Morgans work with, how much, and for which client. And as you can see, you could see Kuhn Loeb is number 3. I confirmed that, in fact, they did do work with German Jewish banks, specifically Kuhn Loeb, in specific amounts. And I also found that the relative amount of profit that was earned on a Kuhn Loeb deal was less than the average profit of all the deals that the Morgans had done. These findings meant that I could move forward with my question, because again, if I had found out that they had done none or little work, or if the deals that they had done with Kuhn Loeb, their profit was so much greater, then we could have been persuaded by the money argument. But that's not what we found. Right? So we continue with the inquiry. But then I had to think about social networks. I had the qualitative evidence that anti-Semitism exists, but how did I know it was not just the prejudice of individual partners? How did we know that it was structural to the Morgan firm, to their business as an organization? Now, first, in order to answer that question, I had to determine how could I measure the Morgan social networks. If the syndicate books were an appropriate proxy for their economic networks, what would be the equivalent source for their social networks? A clue came from their obituaries, and the suggestion of obituaries had originally been suggested to me as an important source for biographical data by one of the librarians at Baker Library at Harvard Business School, Tim Mahoney. Again, it was something that he, as a librarian, mentioned to me very casually. I can literally picture him standing behind a desk saying the word obituary. I don't even know if he realizes, even to this day, how significant this was. But when I began to study them, all the obituaries for all the partners, for multiple banks, for a period of about a half a century, I began to notice that obituaries had a common structure. And one of them, which is so interesting, is that they all ended with a list of their clubs. Right? So this is the case before. After 1965, they stopped listing clubs, which is also very significant, right? But before them, it's almost universal. It was a private members club, just like the Royal Bombay Yacht Club, where we are today. Elite private clubs developed in New York City in the mid-19th century and became very much part of the urban landscape. Clubs were private, but they were not secret, and their activities were regularly reported in the press through gossip and society columns like Club World, for example. The growth of these clubs led to the creation of elite registries such as the Social Register, which was first published in the United States in 1887 and modeled after Britain's Who's Who, which was first published in 1849. Persons listed in the Social Register were referred to as members, and one had to be recommended by a member to be listed. This is a process that mimicked club admissions. We could even think of the Social Register as a club. You could think of it also as a historical Facebook for elites, right? Now, of all the Morgan partners between 1895 and 1940, that's 41 men, 93% or 39 partners were listed in the Social Register, New York or Philadelphia, because there was also a Philadelphia branch called Drexel and Company, 2 years after they became a partner. The only partners who were not listed in the Social Register were those who became partners in 1939, and 2 of them were Canadian. This and another study I conducted with my colleague Dan Haljan of the University of Kentucky, where we correlated the Morgan partners' percentage capital in the firm to their social clubs, which is something that we detail in another paper, indicated that social clubs were important to the firm as an economic organization, that the partners would move up in the firm correlated to the number of clubs that they had in common with other partners, specifically elite clubs. But then I ran into another problem. Well, let me just explain a little bit about what the social register looks like. So the social register always has the acronyms for the clubs here on the left-hand side. And then hathitrust.org actually digitized many of them, not before my project, unfortunately. So I had to go from library to library to library. Philadelphia Historical Society, the New York Society Library, the New York Public Library, New York Columbia's Butler Library, because no one has one complete set of all the social registers for all the cities. The Library of Congress, it took a lot of legwork. But then they digitized them, and this is basically what it looks like. So you could see J.P. Morgan on the bottom, and then Frances L. Tracy was his wife. It always lists the wife's maiden name. And then it has a list of the clubs, which I believe is in the order of their seniority, or how difficult they were to get into, or prestige. So you have the Union, University, Knickerbocker, Brook, Union League, Metropolitan, Century, New York Yacht, Sewanaka Yacht. So there are yacht clubs. Tuxedo, Racket, Riding, Church, and so on. At the very end, they list clubs that are not in the city of New York. So MTW is Metropolitan Washington. EYB is Eastern Yacht Boston. And then CD are his wife's clubs, Colonial Dames, and CLY is Colony. And you could see his daughter, Ann Morgan, who was never married, lived in the same household at this time. She also has her own clubs as well. Now, on the right-hand side, and this will become important later, you can see there is the phone number, the address, and also it tells you when they're in town. So you could say Mr. arrived on the Olympic is probably a name similar to that, August 15th, Mrs. aboard the same ship, September 19th. So they were only together for about 3 weeks, right? This also tells you a little bit about their relationship. And imagine having this kind of information. It was really like a visiting list, right, for elite people today, right? The CEOs of banks today. It's kind of unthinkable, right? It's a remarkable source. The problem is that the social register doesn't tell you how much time the partners actually spent at the clubs. Is it just a title that makes you look good, or are clubs used? Were they actually part of your daily life? To answer this question, I turned to another source that Maria Molestina introduced me to, and those were the date books of Pierpont Morgan from 1899 and 1904 to 1912. Like the syndicate books, Morgan's date books had to be they were also not presented in a form that could be easily analyzed. They had to be translated in a coded Excel file to analyze the place, date, content of his events, to study Morgan's activities related to social clubs, relative to things like boards of directors minutes, or sitting on the boards of charity organizations or art organizations. So this is an example of the date book from 1907. I had been looking at this because there's a very big panic that happens in 1907. And I wanted to see if there was any mention of it. There is not, partly because I believe Morgan himself did not write in this date book. And we know that because of the handwriting, and we also know that because they refer to him as Mr. M in the book. This is always the first page of all the date books. It lists payments that were given. On the bottom, I don't know if you can see, but you will see that Miss Ann Morgan every year was given $5,000. Now, the average pay of an industrial worker working 80 hours a week in this year was $400 a year. All right, so that gives you an idea of how much money she was given by her father every year. So the events were listed, right, on Wednesday, January 2nd, at 7:45 p.m., he had dined with Mr. French, which was a friend of his, also a businessman. Sometimes it also lists the place. So what I did is I translated this into an Excel file. This actually took me only about a month, but it listed the date, what it was for, the time, the place, and then I coded it. Was it a club? Was it a private residence? Was it for a board? And so on. One of the things that I found is about 10% of the 1,955 events listed in the date books directly involved club business or club activities, which was not insignificant. The problem was even if we know that the events were important enough to be listed in the Morgan date books, we don't actually know if he attended, right? Sometimes they were crossed out, but not for every single one. If you looked at my date book 100 years from now, you would know if I went. Because if I go, I cross it out. If I didn't go, I do a double X. There was no such pattern in the Morgan date books. And in the Morgan date books, they mentioned that Mr. M had a small book. Most likely, if we could find that small book, we have a really good idea of what he did, right? Who he saw and so on. Now, it is unlikely that an event would be listed without his approval. But did he actually go? Again, we couldn't assume, but how could I test? I needed independent verification. Now here I benefited from the insights of my fellow Morgan reading room researchers, what I would call the community of the archive. During this time, a CUNY graduate student at Abraham Schiff, in no relation to the Kuhn-Loeb Schiffs, was at the Morgan conducting research on a Hamlet manuscript. The Morgan Library holds many significant manuscripts. Unrelated to the business papers. From Schiff, I learned that the records of the New York Central Railroad, which was an important railroad, and Pierpont Morgan sat on the board, and you could see him sitting on listing the board meetings for not only the railroad but also the subsidiary lines, were housed at the Manuscripts and Archives Division of the New York Public Library, which is only about a 10-minute walk from the Morgan. Bless you. It's located on 40th Street and 5th Avenue. So I went and I visited the New York Public Library, where I discovered the New York Central Boards of Directors meetings included a list of attendees. So it had a roll call. And so you could see all of the lines that make up the New York Penn Central. And what I did is I went through and found all of the meetings and checked the date to see that were in the Morgan date books to see if they matched with the boards of directors minutes to show that J.P. Morgan was actually there or not there. And when I hit upon that strategy, I repeated the same exercise for the New Haven Railroad. You could see I had to figure out what they had and what they didn't have and what book and what box they were in. For the New Haven Railroad, which is another important railroad to the Morgan Bank, that are housed at the University of Connecticut's Thomas J. Dodd Research Center. And then I also did a similar cross-checking for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, on whose board Pierpont Morgan also sat. He was a great art collector, with the assistance of archivist Jim Mosk, who could not give me access to the Board of Trustee records myself, but was very kind enough to check them for me. So I sent him a list of all the meetings, and he wrote me back, and he said, yes, no, yes, no, yes, 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 and so on. Now, as I state in Gentlemen Bankers, the cross-checking verified Morgan's presence or absence for 43% of the events listed in the date books, right? So that's all the ones that we could find for New York Central, New Haven, Metropolitan, and so on. Of those events, I was able to verify, actually written in another source, that J.P. Morgan attended approximately 64%. So though the date books are incomplete, and though we are only checking 43%, I argue that they were, to the best of our ability, a reliable source of Morgan's activities, and thus that they indicated social clubs were an important part of his social world. Now, many of Morgan's business colleagues were also members of the same social clubs. In the text, I repeated this process. I looked at the social register status of 7 of Morgan's bank collaborators, all their partners and their executives, including commercial banks, over a period of 40 years. This was several hundred men. When we look at the social world of the Jewish bankers, they stood out in comparison to the non-Jewish houses because only a small minority of the partners were listed in the social register. 2 Kuhn-Loeb partners were listed, Mortimer Schiff and Otto Kahn, but they were not members of the most elite private men's clubs, with the exception of the New York Yacht Club. Jacob Schiff was never listed in the social register. This one difference, which is only apparent when we study both the social and the economic networks of the bankers, forces us to consider that the structure of the banking community was much more complicated than only their economic ties, such as their syndicate cooperation, would suggest. Thus, the archival and historical data indicate that before the First World War, Morgan and Kuhn-Loeb partners did not patronize the same social, religious, cultural clubs or associations, not just as individuals, but as firms, as organizations. I felt very comfortable in being able to state that in the book because I went one step further to show that there was a social separation by utilizing historical geography, which turned out to be a fateful research decision for other reasons. Now, where one lives in New York City is a strong statement of one's identity and social status. I would not be surprised if you could say that about any city, but on the island of Manhattan, which is so densely populated, the distance and location can be as small as just a few blocks apart, but represent worlds apart. My goal was to map the addresses of the Morgan and Kuhn-Loeb partners to test the theory that their geographic references reflected their social distance. And this was an idea that I got from the social register, which listed a member's home address. And for the as you saw, for the Kuhn-Loeb partners, because they were not listed, I had to find their home addresses from US Census listings or from personal papers. Now, the idea seemed good, but the practical issue of mapping historical addresses was daunting because addresses change over time. New York City has been built and rebuilt. Some buildings have stayed the same, like Jack Morgan's house here, which you see on the left, all right? But again, we can't assume that they would change, and they probably do change. This is Jacob Schiff's house in 1905. This is what it's like now in 2003. Now, early 20th century maps from sources like atlases, almanacs, or business directories do not always have house numbers, and those that do only show small sections of the city. So this is an example where you do have a pretty good map of Manhattan, but it's not going to give you house-level data, and I needed house-level data. Right? I needed one big atlas for all of Manhattan where all the houses were geocoded to the present day. How was I going to find that? Now, to make a very long story short, over a period of about a year, this is another example, I should say. So this is an example of house-level data mapping for the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map Company. And you could see why it's so detailed, because they were done for fire insurance purposes. This book is huge. That's me in the New York Public Library's map room. It was so big, in order for me to take a photograph of it, I had to stand on a stool. All right, so you could see how tall it is. But this is the level of detail I needed. But I needed that for the entire city, and I needed it geocoded. Now, as luck would have it, to make a very long story short, over a period of about a year, and then with the critical assistance of a company called Environmental Data Resources, which owns the copyright to the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, I was able to identify the actual house location of the private homes and offices of the Morgans, Kuhn-Loeb, and other banking syndicate partners at the latitude and longitude level. And I was able to do this because EDR digitized and geocoded the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps, which is a process they actually had done here in India. And it took about 2 years. So thanks to the late John Walker, who is the EDR vice president, and Hank Chin, who is an engineer at EDR, I was given access to the EDR maps, and armed with a list of these historic addresses and dates that I had gathered from the register, from the atlases, from census data, I was able to map hundreds of historic addresses on a geocoded map of New York City using ArcGIS, the Geographic Information System software, with data that was provided by the New York City Planning Office. Today, you could do the same thing with data from the New York Public Library and Google Map Pro for free. And unfortunately, because this is a PDF, we had a PowerPoint version where I actually made a video to kind of show you how to do it. I'll see if during the question and answer period we can get that back. Because you can actually do it yourself now for free using Google Map Pro, because the library has actually geocoded those small Sanborn fire insurance maps, and then they just drop right into where they would be on an everyday map. And then you can drop pins and find the latitude and longitude of a house. So this is an example that just gets uploaded into ArcGIS, and within 2 seconds, it will visualize this map for you. So in the early 1900s and until the First World War, most of the New York Morgan partners lived close together in a neighborhood called Murray Hill, which is between Lexington and Madison Avenue, between 33rd and 39th Streets. It's an older, fashionable neighborhood. They not only lived relatively in close geographic proximity to each other, they also congregated around Pierpont Morgan's home at 219 Madison Avenue, where Morgan had lived since 1881. Now, by the time J.P. Morgan and Company was reorganized in 1895, Jacob Schiff and his partners lived relatively far uptown, some 40 blocks away from the Morgan clique. Now, as you can see, the geographic locations of the bankers' home addresses also have a story to tell about the social distance between the two groups. Verifying, I argued, that the absence of Jewish bankers in the social register what that absence had already suggested, which is that in this key area, that of social networks, merchant banking networks did not overlap. Now, at this point, I want to return to the original question of the book, because it's easy to lose sight of it in all the details of research, because there's so much to do to check off the list in historical verification and testing. The question was, in a business like private investment banking, where personal relations are so important, how did Anglo-American and German Jewish bankers before the Second World War create trust and work together in the context of anti-Semitism? If it wasn't money, then what made it possible? Now, this is when things start to get really interesting, and how the maps became a critical turning point in the book. There was a way that I found that if we visualize historical data in different ways, we can start to see things that should be obvious to us. If we were to look at where the Morgan partners worked downtown, as well as where their syndicate partners worked, and here, for example, is JP Morgan's, this is the corner. That's why it was called the corner, it was right there, okay? In the book, I talk about a bombing that happened on the street in 1920. It was right after this First World War. And you can see Kuhn Loeb moved this office twice, but it's located here and here, very close. Now, there was a way in which I found that if we visualize historical data together, if we looked at where the Morgan partners worked downtown, as well as their syndicate partners, and we contrasted it to where they lived uptown, they worked in a very concentrated area on Wall Street. And I created that earlier map based on a sample of syndicate participants in the Morgan Syndicate books. When I visualized them, these two maps together, their place of work and their place of home, this is when the answer to the question began to take full form. One that was so clearly obvious, it shouldn't have taken me years of mapping and coding and study to discover. And yet it was only through this process that I was able to see so clearly what was there by not being there, what was missing. And in many ways, I think this is what history helps us to do, to see what we take for granted about ourselves and also about the past. The book argues that the key to understanding their relationship was understanding the way in which business was not separate from society, but how they were organized in the context of their society. In other words, the key factor that I discovered in the maps is not that the distance between the homes of the Protestants and the Jews were so far apart uptown, but the fact that both of their homes were so far away from where they worked. The way that they were able to work together was that they separated their home life from their work life, which gives renewed meaning to the term gentlemen bankers. Because one key difference between where they worked and where they lived was the absence of women in the world downtown. Thus, the answer to how elite private bankers of different ethno-religious backgrounds were able to create trust and work together in the context of anti-Semitism was that their gendered organization of their society allowed them to act as equals and as men in the world of finance, to make it seem as if that world was separate from society, even when other evidence, like social clubs, indicated that it was not. Now, it's important to note that women were assumed not to be present in the world of finance, but that does not mean that they were not there at all. They were relegated to different spaces, yes. Out of sight in some cases, yes. But they could also be hiding in plain sight, revealing other significant societal divisions like race. In the book, I talk at greater length about the significance of the figure of Belle de Costa Green Van Vliet, also known as Belle Greener, who is Pierpont Morgan's private librarian. Born to an African-American family, Green lived in the center of the domestic world of J.P. Morgan from the early 20th century until her death in 1950. But, and this is the key caveat, she had to pass as a white woman to do so. By her very presence and the conditions in which she lived, the fact that she had to pass as white to belong, Green exposes the gendered and racialized segregation that the world of private bankers assumed and also benefited from. This is not as obvious when we only look at Jews, because despite their severe discrimination, at this time they were still afforded the privileges of whiteness in citizenship, for example, which racialized minorities like Asians and blacks were not. Now, after the publication of Gentlemen Bankers, it became very clear to me what my next project would be. If the segregation of women was so important to the world of private bankers, what happened when women began to be more visible in the world of American finance in the post-Second World War period? What happened when the inclusion of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, men and women on Wall Street also became a public, political, and legal issue for the financial community as a whole? In the 1950s, African American companies were not even allowed real estate. Oh, sorry about that. Not even allowed real estate on Wall Street. But by 1973, as writer Andrew Tobias wrote in New York Magazine, times were changing, and even the Morgans were, quote, moving to keep up with the changing financial and social environment. At the time, Morgan Guarantee, which is J.P. Morgan's successor bank, had about 1,000 officers, out of which 6, or 0.6%, were African American, and 59, or 6%, were women. Tobias considered these changes to be a sign that, quote, the number of minority employees would be growing in the future like a hot stock. He did note that the number of Jewish employees are harder to come by, but stated that they were also on the rise. In 1986, when the New York Times published an article that declared Wall Street as, quote, no longer a WASP preserve, the larger point it tried to make was that competition and deregulation had been forcing Wall Street banks to become more meritocratic. As evidence, it detailed the biographies of Jewish American bankers who had risen to the top of large banks that had not been founded by Jews. Moreover, the article stated, quote, not only Jews, but other ethnic Americans are now moving into the upper echelons in rising numbers, including second-generation Italian Americans. The caveat, however, is that the article also reported many white ethnic bankers expressed great discomfort with being asked to, quote, discuss the subject in any detail, including, quote, ethnic Americans benefiting from their promotion, Catholic and Jewish. According to the Times, talking about one's ethno-religious background was deemed awkward, and, quote, even those who discussed the issue seemed uncomfortable about it. Most insisted that their names not be used. Those who would talk for the record generally denied that ethnicity or lack of it had anything to do with their rise in banking, unquote. Significantly, women and racial minorities did the same. They were reluctant to highlight their gender or race. They were often quoted as saying that they were no different either, a narrative that persists to the present day, with few exceptions. Now, to return to the theme and title of the talk, it is business and it is personal. The point that I'm making is that the persistence of the desire to deny the personal in American finance, to deny the embeddedness of finance in society, is really historically significant. The insistence that the world of business is somehow separate from the world around is reflective of an aspiration. What does this desire, which is presented in story form, tell us about what might be hiding in plain sight? And if it were true, why, as the numbers of women, Asian, Black, and Latino employees grow at banks, why are they still well underrepresented in the C-suite? And if it were true, why do they, like Asian American investment managers, who I'm currently in the process of interviewing, talk about the barriers to promotion that appear unrelated to their performance. You can see the question starting to form and the way that questions form when evidence collides. The question that has become the topic of my next book on American finance studies the function of this storytelling, the persistence of the idea that business is not personal, to the story of American meritocracy. We might call the myth of American meritocracy. Though that study of the people of Wall Street after the Second World War is a topic for another day, as I reflect on the process of studying the world of private banking before the war, I can only hope that the journey of discovery will be as filled along the way as I've shown, with great collaborations with colleagues, with archives, archivists, and libraries with whom it would not have been possible, interesting, or enjoyable to finish that project. And I want to thank them, and I want to thank all of you for listening today.